Breaking news now. Message from Australia to NATO. While in Vilnius for this week's NATO summit, Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese must send the messages that his country is still a staunch ally of Ukraine, that it retains its independence in dealing with Beijing, and that transatlantic and Indo-Pacific security are inextricably linked. His NATO colleagues will be thinking about all three of these things. Australia is proud of its reputation for success on the world stage despite its relatively small population. Australia was the first country to look beyond the seemingly endless threat of terrorism and instead draw attention to the contemporary challenges emanating from the Chinese Communist Party. This included supporting Southeast Asian neighbors against illegal unilateral activities in the South China Sea, protecting technology and infrastructure, and calling out cyber intrusions. The rest of the world has been woken up in recent years by Australia's policies and actions to the dangers of authoritarian aggression and the significance of the Indo-Pacific. There is a growing awareness of ASEAN's centrality and the need for collective action against Beijing's worst behavior, as evidenced by the quadrilateral security dialogue between the United States, India, France, the United Kingdom, South Korea, and most recently Lithuania. Albanese and German Chancellor Olaf Scholz reaffirmed their commitment to strengthening military ties yesterday during Albanese's visit to Berlin in advance of NATO. NATO is looking to increase cooperation with this region by inviting the Indo-Pacific partner countries to Vilnius and considering Japan's offer of a Tokyo liaison office, despite some regrettable but not unexpected reluctance from French President Emmanuel Macron. Our previous Prime Minister would have had a tough time convincing NATO or the EU of the importance of the Indo-Pacific and the threats posed by Beijing. With the shock of Vladimir Putin's war in Ukraine, China's aggressive economic coercion, and the Moscow-Beijing no-limits partnership, NATO countries are now wondering where Australia stands on the rapidly growing concerns about economic security. Japan's recent hosting of the G7 meeting, at which leaders proclaimed the need for ongoing strategic coordination on economic resilience and economic security by reducing vulnerabilities and countering malign practices, and improving a well-functioning international rules-based system, in particular the multilateral trading system with the WTO at its co-chair, is an example of how many of our global partners have not only joined us but pushed further, embarking on an economic security strategy. Albanese's goal should be to reassure his NATO counterparts that Australia is still an important contributor to the alliance's ability to strategically coordinate and collectively support international institutions and rules. Because of this, Australia must maintain its strong backing for Ukraine. It's reasonable to assume that rising living expenses would cause the public to put the economy first, but Australians have proven time and again to be better multitaskers than their government. With any luck, President Volodymyr Zelensky will convince Albanese to bring a new package of everything Australia has to offer, including more Bushmasters, after the public outcry over the recently announced inadequate level of assistance. The question about Ukraine has been answered. Many of our allies recognize that there is no separation of economics and security, or of Europe and the Indo-Pacific, and that national and collective strategies are required to counter authoritarian dominance, which raises the other two questions about global security and China. The United States, European Union, Japan, and others have established a de-risking policy, which entails, first, protecting economies from becoming too reliant on China, or Russia, and, second, pinpointing the areas where conducting business is inadvisable for reasons of national security. Since China is both the EU's top trading partner and top security concern, the European Commission released its economic security strategy last month with the goal of reducing risk across supply chains, outbound investment, critical infrastructure, and technology. Meanwhile, the Dutch have joined the United States and Japan in limiting chip-making equipment exports to China in an effort to rein in Beijing's aggressive military rise. The first year of the Albanese government was marked by success in maintaining security policy and reducing political rhetoric toward China. The question of whether this philosophy of cooperate where we can, disagree where we must, was sustainable over the long term has always been present. In order for a dual strategy to be successful, both components must be in motion. When the path of disagreement becomes impassable, parties risk falling back on an ineffective policy of blind engagement. This is because the meaning of must is ambiguous. If policymakers and politicians narrow the scope of diplomacy to fostering friendly relations between nations, they will have little to react to. As a result of years of missed opportunities to deter Putin, we are now witnessing the horrors of war in Europe. Australia is under no obligation to offer Ukraine a sufficient aid package, but we should. Although Australia is not obligated to join international sanctions against Russia, Iran, and China for human rights abuses of this magnitude, we should. When it comes to crimes against humanity in Xinjiang, such as forced sterilization and labor, the United States, the European Union, the United Kingdom, and Canada have all sanctioned those responsible, but Australia does nothing. Australia could drop its case against China in the World Trade Organization over tariffs on barley. However, Australia's decision to suspend and likely end the case has removed the ability for all countries, especially small states less able to take on major powers, to point to a global finding and lost the opportunity to build trust in the multilateral system we say we care about. Australia could follow the path of other countries that are inspired by the appealing rhetoric of principles but fail to put them into practice if it adopts a policy of only making defense and security decisions when required or forced to. Instead, it is in Australia's national interest to declare support for Ukraine and the inseparability of the transatlantic and Indo-Pacific alongside its NATO counterparts. Albanese can keep the world believing that Australia follows its principles, says what it means, and does what it says if he does so.